Among all the horrors of trench warfare in World War I, there's one largely overlooked form of combat going on under no man's land. And this one made everything happening on the surface seem not so bad. It was tunnel warfare, arguably the worst job you could get in a war already full of horrible jobs. By November 1914, the war of movement in the West was over. Both sides had spent weeks trying to slip around each other's open flank in what became known as the Race to the Sea. And when that failed, what was left was a 400-mile-long line of opposing trenches. There were no flanks left to turn, so any attack now had to go across the open ground between the trenches. And that ground was covered by machine guns, artillery, and belts of barbed wire. So, crossing it in daylight simply wasn't going to happen. Although this didn't stop commanders from sending their men to die anyway. Neither side was strong enough to force a breakthrough, and by the end of May 1915, the entire front was one big deadlock. And it wasn't long before someone got the idea to dig the tunnel under that ground, swept by the machine guns and artillery. You go under it, you plant tons of explosives beneath the enemy's position, and you blow them up from below. That was the theory at least. The Germans tried this out first. Their army already had trained engineer troops, and they dug shallow tunnels from their front trench and fired a row of small mines under the trenches of the Sirhind Brigade of the Indian Corps. The blasts ran along some 1,000 yards of trench, and a German infantry attack went immediately after the explosion, killing over 800 men of the Indian Corps in just a few minutes. Seeing that this might work, Germans planted more mines under British trenches. While the British had absolutely no answer to this new tactic. German mining had become a serious problem that the High Command couldn't ignore anymore. But then came one man who changed everything for the British, a guy called John Norton Griffiths. He was a self-made civil engineering contractor whose companies had built railways, harbours and tunnels. In late 1914, one of his firms happened to be digging sewer tunnels under Manchester, where his workers used a specialised digging technique perfectly suited to soft clay. So, when he heard about the German mines and about British digging failing in the wet Flanders soil, he offered to bring a squad of his sewermen over to France to tunnel under the German lines. But he was ignored. It took the problem getting bad enough before the British finally decided to actually do something about it. And that's when he got to explain the technique that would change the whole underground war. Clay kicking. Here's how it worked. The digger, called the kicker, lay on his back on a wooden frame shaped like a cross, wedged into the tunnel so he reclined at about 45 degrees with his feet toward the face. His tool was a sharpened, spade-like thing called a grafting tool, with 2 footrests sitting above the blade. So he'd drive the blade into the clay with his legs, twist out a lump, and pass it back over his head. Behind him, a bagger filled sandbags with the spoil, and a trammer wheeled the bags back down the tunnel on a small trolley and came back with timber for the walls. And those timber supports worked without a single nail or screw. They were cut in such a way that they could be assembled, and then moisture would make the wood swell and lock in place. So you didn't have to hammer nails that'd reveal your mining operation to the prying enemy ear. But you're going to hear all that when the underground war spiraled out of control. On top of the silence, it was much faster than any other method. The catch was that clay kicking only worked in the right ground. It needed firm, plastic clay, like the blue clay layer sitting under the wet surface soil of Flanders. Further south, on the Somme and around Arras, the ground was chalk, so clay kicking couldn't be used there. Now, chalk had its own advantages, since it drained well and long stretches of tunnel needed no timbering at all. But it had to be dug with picks, which ring through solid ground, so digging in chalk was slow, noisy work that the enemy could hear. Miners there learned to cut the chalk out with quieter hand tools to keep the sound down. The Germans, whose civil engineers had never come up with clay kicking back home, didn't even know the technique existed, and for the entire war they dug with mattocks, which are pick-like tools. So, once the British tunnelling companies got established, they took the advantage away from the Germans and completely turned the tide of the underground war. British teams in clay could drive their tunnels at rates around 8 meters a day, against roughly 2 meters for the Germans, and they did it more quietly on top of that. Now, the basic idea was to dig a shaft down behind your own front line, then drive a horizontal tunnel, called a gallery, under no man's land until you reach the enemy trench. There, you hollow out a chamber, pack it with explosives, and tamp the tunnel behind the charge with sandbags, so the blast goes up instead of back down the tunnel. Then, you fire it electrically at the chosen moment. The explosion destroys the trench and everyone in it and leaves a large crater, and your infantry rush across and grab the crater before the enemy recovers. And the lip of earth thrown up around craters was usually higher than the surrounding ground, which gave whoever held it a view over the enemy's lines. So, savage little battles were fought over possession of craters all through 1915 and 1916. Blowing mines under the enemy front line quickly became a regular feature of local attacks, and then larger and more numerous mines were getting blown in the opening minutes of the major offensives. Because of the enormous urgency, the tunneling companies themselves were formed at a speed unmatched anywhere else in the war. Men who'd been digging sewers as civilians found themselves in as little as 4 days digging under no man's land. Skilled miners were paid 6 shillings a day, roughly 4 times an infantry private's pay, and about double what a normal sapper got, which of course caused pay arguments. But once you hear what was actually happening down there, you're going to understand exactly why these men earned more than the soldier sitting in the trench above them, thinking he got the worst job. Canadian, New Zealand, and Australian tunneling companies were soon formed as well, and the war under the ground was now about to spiral completely out of control. During 1916, about 1,500 actual mines were exploded on the British front alone. And on top of that came many thousands of smaller underground charges that never even broke the surface. At the peak, 227 mines were blown in a single month. Do the math on that, and it works out to 1 explosion every 3 hours. And all of this was happening in tunnels about 4 feet high and under 3 feet wide, lit by candles and dug by men working shifts of 6 to 8 hours underground. Now, everything underground came down to one rule. The enemy can't see you, so the only way he can find you is to hear you. So both sides ended up fighting a war against noise itself. British miners worked in soft-soled shoes instead of hobnailed army boots. The Germans, on the other hand, kept their hobnails on underground for the whole war. The small trolleys carrying spoil out of the British galleries ran on rails that were screwed down instead of nailed, and by 1916, every British mine trolley ran on self-oiling bearings, so the wheels wouldn't accidentally squeak. Every tunneling company kept a large number of specially selected men who did nothing but listen. They worked at the end of short side tunnels dug off the main galleries as listening posts, and in the early days they had only the naked ear, or crude tricks like watching the surface of water in a glass for vibration, or even pushing a stick into the ground and biting on it to feel vibrations. But from 1915, the British had a purpose-built instrument called the Geophone, 2 wooden discs, connected by rubber tubes to stethoscope earpieces. You'd place both discs on the tunnel floor and move one around the other until the sound came through with equal strength in both ears, so you could take a compass bearing on it. A geophone could pick up digging around 50 meters away. After taking bearings on the same sound from multiple listening posts, they'd draw them on paper, and where the lines crossed, that's where the enemy was. These guys were lying or kneeling alone for hours, in a cramped, black, dripping tunnel, in total silence, straining to hear picks and shovels working somewhere in the earth around them, and when enemy digging that had been heard for days suddenly stopped. One very likely explanation was that the enemy had finished his tunnel and was now quietly loading explosives into it. Men worked their whole shifts, knowing the enemy might be a few feet away through the wall. So the new cat-and-mouse game began, called countermining, and the thing called the Camouflet became the most feared weapon underground. It was a small charge, calculated to be just big enough to collapse a small pocket of ground without breaking the surface or making a crater, and it was used to collapse the enemy tunnel and bury or gas the men inside it. They'd be quietly digging tunnels toward the sound of the enemy, and when they get close, they'd dig the tunnel underneath the enemy and place camouflages. And that happened all the time. In fact, most attack tunnels never even reached the enemy line. They were found and collapsed by countermines somewhere under no man's land. It was a private war of miners against miners, and the methods only got darker as it went on. After blowing a first charge into an enemy gallery, a second charge could be timed to explode later and kill the rescue party that would come down to dig out the eventual survivors of the first one. Both sides also occasionally detonated very large charges underground to wreck the ground itself, leaving it unstable so the enemy couldn't dig tunnels without risking a collapse. And then there was the situation both sides feared probably the most, when opposing tunnels accidentally met each other, after which the horrific hand-to-hand fighting in darkness and in cramped space would follow. Tunnelers were carrying knives, pistols, and even shortened rifles with the barrels and stocks cut out, in case they ran into their enemy underground. But one of the biggest killers down there was actually something you couldn't see or smell. Every explosion, from a mine or camouflet, and of course the heavy shelling on the surface, all produce carbon monoxide that ends up under the ground. The gas is colorless and odorless, and it gives no warning whatsoever before it's too late. The airspace in the tunnels was tiny, and proper ventilation was pretty much impossible. Some survivors of gassing were left with permanent mental damage, and gassed, half-conscious men were known to fight the very rescuers trying to drag them out. Mice were used as detectors first, but then canaries became the standard, because a canary's fast metabolism and huge oxygen demand make it collapse from carbon monoxide before the man would, meaning it was now time to get out of the tunnel ASAP. So birds in cages were carried down the shafts and watched diligently. The British also set up mine rescue schools behind the front, and the rescuers were called Proto Men, after the proto-breathing set they wore, a self-contained oxygen rebreather giving up to 2 hours of air. These were hand-picked, experienced miners, chosen specifically for staying calm under pressure. And when a gallery was blown in or gassed, the proto-men went down into it with lifelines and stretchers to bring out whoever was left through ground that might collapse again or be blown again at any moment. Even without any enemy action, tunnels could collapse on their own, from unstable ground, from shell fire above, or from the shock waves of nearby blasts. Galleries flooded, especially in the wet ground of Flanders, where a breached wet layer could quickly flood a tunnel before anyone could get out. When such things happened, whole shifts were lost at once. William Hackett, for example, was a 43-year-old coal miner who'd been rejected by the infantry 3 times because of his age, before the tunnelers took him. In June 1916, near Givenchy, a German mine brought down the gallery he was working in, trapping him and 4 others 40 feet underground. A rescue party dug for 2 days and managed to open a small hole through the collapsed earth and broken timber. Hackett pushed his 3 men through the hole, and he could have easily gone through himself. But the 5th man, Thomas Collins, a badly injured 22-year-old Welsh soldier attached to the tunnelers, couldn't move, and Hackett refused to leave him. The hole kept shrinking, and the gallery soon collapsed completely. The rescuers dug on desperately for 4 more days, under German shelling of the shaft head, but the 2 men were never reached. Hackett was given a posthumous Victoria Cross, the only one ever awarded to a tunneler, and he and Collins lie under the fields of Givenchy to this very day. The worst single example of men sealed underground happened in the Winterberg Tunnel. It was a German communication and shelter tunnel, about 300 meters long and more than 20 meters deep, built so troops, ammunition and supplies could move between the front line and the rear without being seen or shelled. But in May 1917, French observers in a balloon worked out the exact positions of both ends of the tunnel, and French heavy artillery opened targeted fire on them. A heavy shell at the northern entrance set off ammunition stockpiled inside the tunnel, and another strike collapsed the southern exit. That sealed the tunnel, with some 270 men inside. And no rescue was possible because the whole area stayed under French attack. The trapped men died over about 6 days, with only 3 of them getting out alive through a small breach. The rest are still in the tunnel to this day. Ammonal was the standard British explosive for the big mines, and it's a simple mixture mostly of ammonium nitrate, plus aluminium powder, TNT, and charcoal. The ammonium nitrate provides the oxygen for the reaction. The aluminium is the fuel that adds violence to the blast, and the TNT makes the whole charge easier to detonate reliably. And an Ammonal reaction creates a supersonic shockwave, delivering vastly more destructive power per kilogram than gunpowder, for example. It was cheap, it was safe to handle because it was not easy to ignite, but its big weakness was that it soaks up moisture from the air, and wet Ammonal won't detonate. That's a serious problem in flooded Flanders ground, so the charges were sealed in soldered metal tins or rubberized bags. And keep that information in mind, you'll see why in a bit. While the underground war on the Western Front was still growing, the same thing was already happening on other fronts, and in some places under even worse conditions. At Gallipoli in 1915, the opposing trenches were only a few yards apart. Both sides mined constantly at close range, often with only a few meters of earth between opposing tunnels, and men regularly blew straight into each other's galleries. But the most extreme version of this war was fought in the Alps and the Dolomites, on the front between Italy and Austria-Hungary. That mountain front, much of it above 2,000 meters, was deadlocked just like everywhere else. And since neither side could attack across the cliffs, both dug into the mountains, carving galleries, barracks, and gun positions into solid rock. On the Marmelada, the Austrians even cut a tunnel city of several kilometers inside the glacier ice. And unlike Flanders clay or Somme chalk, the Dolomite rock had to be attacked with hand drills and chisels. Whole mountaintops were blown off up there, and the largest single mine of the entire war is credited to this front. an Austrian charge of 50 tons of blasting gelatine, fired under the Italians on Monte Posubio in March 1918. Back on the Western Front, the mine set for the first day of the Battle of the Somme, July 1, 1916, showed how far the method had come. British tunneling companies laid 19 mines under the German front line, 8 large and 11 small. The biggest were at Hawthorn Ridge with about 40,000 pounds of Ammonal at La Boisselle, where the Weissap mine held another 40,000 pounds and the Lochnagar mine held 2 linked charges of 36,000 and 24,000 pounds. The Hawthorn Ridge mine became the famous one because it was filmed from about half a mile away, which you've probably seen. The craters are still there today, with human remains in the ground in and around them. Now, to understand the peak of this whole underground war, you first need to understand the ground itself. Under much of the Flanders battlefield, the ground came in 3 layers. A topsoil of wet sandy clay, then a treacherous waterlogged layer of running quicksand, and beneath that, the dry, firm blue clay that was ideal for deep tunneling. That blue clay was the prize, because a gallery down there sat below the depth where the enemy was digging and listening. The problem was getting through the sand layer to reach it, as the water would go through the wooden lining and sink the shaft. And the Germans looked at this layer and concluded that deep mining through it was impossible, and they held on to that belief until 1916. The British, however, came up with a technique called tubbing, borrowed from civilian mine engineering. Instead of timber, the shaft was lined with prefabricated cylindrical sections of steel. They were bolted together one on top of the next as the shaft went down, forming a continuous watertight metal tube through the wet layer. Once the tube reached the dry blue clay below the sands, the miners switched back to clay kicking. And because the Germans were convinced the sands couldn't be crossed, they didn't believe deep British galleries could possibly exist under their positions. So, they concentrated their countermining at the shallower levels, where the British were deliberately keeping them busy with minor feint attacks. You can probably already see where this is going. The peak of the whole underground war came a year after the Somme, at Messines Ridge in Belgium, south of Ypres. The ridge was German-held high ground overlooking the British lines, and the idea of destroying it from below already started in 1915. British, Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand tunneling companies dug under it for roughly 2 years, driving deep galleries through the blue clay, some over 600 meters long and up to about 38 meters down. In total, more than 20 mines were prepared and charged, with a combined load of around 450 tons of Ammonal and gun cotton. Germans found and destroyed 1 British mine under La Petite Douve Farm, with a Camouflet in August 1916, and their tunnelers came within meters of several other charged chambers without ever realizing what was sitting next to them. But the German command misjudged the danger, and that misjudgment is what turned Messines into a catastrophe. In the weeks before the attack, the German command was convinced the ridge was safe. However, at 3:10 a.m. on June 7, 1917, after 20 minutes of eerie silence, nervous German troops fired flares to find out what was happening. Then, 19 mines went up along a roughly 6-mile stretch of the ridge, over the space of about 20 seconds. The combined explosion ranks among the largest man-made explosions before the atomic bomb. British infantry took the entire ridge within hours, along with over 7,300 German prisoners, many of them dug out dazed from the wrecked earth. After Messines, the underground war wound down fast because the front was open for the first time and the fighting became more mobile towards the end. However, the war ended with live mines still in the ground. Not every charge prepared for Messines had been fired that morning. The mine under La Petite Douve Farm, holding 50,000 pounds of explosive 80 feet down, had been abandoned after that German Camouflet attack wrecked its gallery. One of the galleries under Peckham Farm, loaded with about 20,000 pounds, was abandoned when it collapsed after the pumps failed. And a group of 4 more mines, dug under a German strongpoint called the Birdcage near Ploegsteert Wood, was deliberately left unfired, because the Germans had pulled back just before the attack. And when the German Spring Offensive of 1918 overran the area, the British headquarters records relating to the mines were lost. So, altogether, 6 large abandoned charges, totaling over 80 tons of explosive, lay forgotten with nobody knowing where exactly they are anymore. Then, on July 17th, 1955, 38 years after it was laid, one of the 4 Birdcage mines, about 32,000 pounds of Ammonal, went off on its own near Le Pellerin in Belgium. When electricity came to the area after the Second World War, a pylon had been put up right over the forgotten mine. Lightning hit it, and the current apparently ran down and reached the detonators. The blast tore out a large crater and wrecked the pylon and a stretch of road, while the only casualty was a single cow. And what surprised the experts was that the Ammonal still worked at all, since if you remember what I said earlier, it's an explosive that normally degrades in damp, and those tunnels had long since flooded. But the careful wartime waterproofing, with the explosive packed in tins under tarred canvas and the detonators sealed in bottles, had kept the charge live for 4 decades. The other 5 charges are still down there. Around 150,000 pounds of explosive is still underground in who knows what condition, and no one knows whether or when it could be activated.